In Jesus. There's power in the name of
the story. In Genesis chapter 18. Genesis chapter 18, we're looking at a story so that we could see it in experience in somebody's life. Genesis 18, chapter 10, it says this. And he said, I will certainly return unto you according to the time of life. And lo, Sarah your wife shall have a son. And Sarah heard it in the tent door, which was behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old and well stricken in age, and it ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. Therefore Sarah laughed within herself, saying, after I am old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord being old also? And the Lord said unto Abraham, wherefore did Sarah laugh, saying, shall I of surety bear a child, which am old? Is anything too hard for God or for the Lord? At the time appointed I will return unto you according to the time of life, and Sarah shall have a son. Then Sarah denied, saying, I laugh not, for she was afraid. And he said, nay, but you did laugh. You can't fool God. But here's the situation. Circumstances contradicted the possibility of her giving birth. She was 90 years old. Her husband, Abraham, was 100 years old. So the circumstances didn't fit. History contradicted the possibility of her giving birth. No one her age had been pregnant. She had had a barren womb all her life. She never demonstrated a faith to believe the impossible. History contradicted the possibility of her giving birth. And then also she talked Abraham into an illegitimate relationship. So historically she had these things against her. She was of an old age that had not happened before. She had a barren womb. She never demonstrated faith to believe that she could have a child. And then she talked her husband into having an illegitimate relationship with her handmaid. Then finally logic or reason contradicted the possibility of her giving birth. First of all, it does not make sense for a couple of their advanced ages to give birth. Now, come on, y'all. How many of y'all want to give birth at 90 years old? Right now, I'm praying for my children to have grandkids before I get a little bit older. Pray for them to have children, because I don't want to be too old trying to run around some little kid. All right? Oh, yes. Next, logic and reason contradict the possibility of her giving birth. How could it be possible for them to conceive a child? That doesn't make sense. It's unreasonable. It is beyond the imagination. Third, it was against nature for them to have a child at their advanced age. Every logical argument that they had made that this promise was invalid and it would not happen. And that's why she laughed. See, all human probability was against the possibility that at her time of life she would become a mother. It was against reason. It was against logic. It was against history. It was against circumstances. And Hebrews, let's see what happens. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 11. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 11 says this. Through faith also, Sarah herself received strength to receive seed and was delivered of a child when she was past age, because she judged him faithful who had promised. What a change. want to change. Look at this here. The argument seems to be that here was a case where all human probabilities were against what was promised. And therefore, there must have been simple trust in God.
Yes.
When she became pregnant, when she conceived her and her husband, it began to dispel all of the contradictions, all of the things that said it could not happen. The promise of God overruled everything that said no way, no how. Nothing else but faith could have led her to believe that in her old age she would give birth to a son. So after she laughed, over some time period, faith began to be nurtured in her spirit to believe the promise. Maybe her husband Abraham kept reminding her, we're going to have a child. God said we're going to have a child. And he kept repeating it. And she began saying, no, I don't believe it. No. But then he kept repeating it over and over again. God said we're going to have a child. And then finally it clicked within her. Oh my God. See, Sarah laughed till she knew it would be a word not spoken in jest. But it was a promise of God. What God spoke to you was not spoken as something to just arouse your emotions and to stimulate your feelings. No, what God spoke to you was a promise. Sarah's faith in the faithfulness of God. Look at this here. She started out as a non-believer, but ultimately she became a person that believed in the promise of God. The faith that she had in the faithfulness of God. And understand, it was in the faithfulness of God. See, the promise that she held on to was based on the fact that God was a faithful God. The promises that we have is based on the fact that God is a faithful God. See, this faith in the faithfulness of God kept the promise of God alive. When you have faith in the faithfulness of God, the promise that God has given you will keep it alive. In the morning, no matter what you experienced last night, no matter how bad you may have tossed and turned, you may have worried yourself crazy last night, in the morning, if you have belief in the faithfulness of God, you can wake up, Lord, I thank you for your mercy and your grace. God, your word said, I have your compassion new this morning. I need it right now, God, because I struggled all last night with something that was perplexing in my life. And so your faithfulness says that you're giving me mercy to make it through this day. You give me compassion that I may be sustained during this day. You got to keep the promise of God alive through your belief and your confidence in the faithfulness of God. Whatever it is, oh my God, you struggle in your relationship with your spouse, you got to believe in the faithfulness of God. Lord, I wake up tomorrow morning, I believe it's going to give me mercy with my spouse. You're going to give me compassion with my spouse. Wake up every morning expecting the mercy of God to help you deal with that foolishness. Every morning they come up with something new, something crazy. Oh yeah, well God, you gave me mercy to handle them today. I don't have to fly over the handle. I got to pull my hair out because your faithfulness is empowering me to confront the challenges, whether it's on your job and somebody irritates you every day. They get under your skin. You wake up in the morning, Lord, it's a new day. I got to go to work. But your faithfulness has promised that your mercy will carry me through this day. Faith in the faithfulness of God kept the promise alive. Faith in the faithfulness of God, it gave the promise of God power in her life. And when you have faith in the faithfulness of God, it empowers you as you believe in the promises. It infuses the power and the Spirit of God in you. When you feel weak, when you feel like you're about to give up, when it feels When you say, Lord, I believe that you are a faithful God. Lord, I believe you fulfill your word. I believe you honor your promises. I believe in you. See, the faith and the faithfulness of God, it gives the promise of God power in your life. Faith in the faithfulness of God provides the promise of God opportunity to glorify God. When you go to work and you are no longer irritated by the craziness and foolishness of your coworker, that's not getting under your skin and you acting unlike a Christian should, you begin showing and demonstrating the character of Christ, you're glorifying God. Amen. When your spouse is doing everything they can to just do harm or wrong to you, and yet you're glorifying God by walking in the promise of God, you're glorifying Him. When your children are not behaving and doing the things that you would like them to do, but yet because of your belief in the promise of God and you retain and you walk in it, it allows you to have an opportunity to see the glory of God. Oh my God, let me hurry up. Listen what it says in verse 11 of Hebrews, in section C, that last clause, it says, because she judged him faithful who had promised. She judged him faithful who has promised. In essence, Sarah formed an opinion or conclusion about God's faithfulness. She concluded God would fulfill His promise, whatever difficulties might stand in the way of its fulfillment. She made that assessment. She considered the matter. She had all reasons why not to believe. But yet she looked at the faithfulness of God and she judged that it doesn't matter the difficulties, doesn't matter the contradictions, doesn't matter the problems, God is faithful to His promises. She settled within her heart, God will keep His word. This is the attitude that we have to have. We have to judge the faithfulness of God to keep His word and His promises. When we consider the promise God has made, what are the thoughts about the circumstance we have? When we consider the promises of God that are made, what are our thoughts about our history? When we consider the promises of God has made, what are our thoughts about the logic or the reasons of? There are promises of God that will contradict the circumstances, contradict the history, and contradict the logic. But if we judge God to be faithful, we will receive the promise. I challenge you to say, Lord, I judge you to be faithful. Yes. You are a faithful God. Nothing going to cause me to doubt that you are able and willing to fulfill your promise, that you are consistent, that you will confirm your word because you bind yourself to your promise by your faithfulness. No difficulty or hindrance should cause a disbelief of the promise of God. The reasons, there are two reasons why no difficulty or hindrance should cause us to disbelieve the promise of God. The first reason is God makes the promise. That's a reason why don't worry about the difficulties. Don't worry about the problems. Don't worry about what seems to be an obstruction. God makes the promise. I'm not depending on a promise made by a man. I'm depending on a promise made by God. And then secondly, God receives the promise. Excuse me, not the God, but faith receives the promise. So God makes the promise, faith receives the promise. This morning I was listening to our message that we posted on YouTube about the power, the releasing the power of acknowledgement, part 2. And there was something I mentioned about a situation on a block that irritated me for quite a while. But when I was preaching that sermon and going over that sermon, I was expressing my anxiety and my trouble, but then how God had called me to put it into his hands. And it's amazing how things have changed. Amazing how things have changed in my neighborhood. Without me intervening, without me doing anything, God allowed the situation to be taken care of by somebody else. Amen. God is a good God, y'all. He made a promise and he kept his promise as I operated in faith. Finally, judging God faithful to fulfill his promise, here's what it does. It honors God. When you dare say, in the face of your problem, in the face of the storm and the trouble you're going through, I trust God that he is faithful, you honoring God. That means that you are elevating to high esteem. You are accentuating the supremacy of God over your problems. It doesn't matter where they come from, who they come from, and how often they come. When you say, I judge the faithfulness of God to keep his promise, you're honoring God. And then secondly, you're glorifying God. And that means you're demonstrating confidence in God's abilities and his resources. You're saying, God, I don't have it. I can't do it on my own. I'm unable to resolve the matter and to meet the need. I'm unable to pay the debt. I'm unable, Lord, to fix the situation, Lord. Now I'm going to the doctor and this, but Lord, I believe in your faithfulness. I believe that you are faithful to your promise, Lord. And as you do that and you live that way, you are glorifying God. You are demonstrating confidence in God's abilities and resources, despite what the bankers say, despite what your bank account says, despite what your doctor says, despite what the lawyer says. When you say, Lord, I believe in you. Amen. And your promise. And then finally, judging God faithful to fulfill his promise, it blesses God. Yes. When you are willing to stand flat-footed, when you're willing to stare your trouble in the face, look it dead in the eye, and say, I believe in the faithfulness of my God. He will fulfill his promise to me. You are expressing gratitude. It's an expression of gratitude, of appreciation, and praise. Amen. This is why we should judge the faithfulness of God. Because it honors God, it glorifies God, and it blesses God. Any person that claims to be a child of God, and you have doubts about the faithfulness of God, you think that your problem is too big, you think your circumstances are out of hand, you believe that there's nothing that God could do, how in the world could you honor God with that attitude? How in the world could you glorify God with that disposition? How in the world could you bless God when you fail to believe God? Let us judge God faithful. Yes. The promises of God and the faithfulness of God, they go hand in hand. Amen. Amen. Let's bow our heads. Thank you, Lord.
Say it again, Jesus. There's power